Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Rabbi Elie Kaunfer. He's the president and CEO of the Hadar Institute, whose mission is to empower Jews to create and sustain vibrant, practicing, egalitarian communities of Torah, Avodah, and Hesed. Kaunfer is also a co-founder of the independent minyan Kehilat Hadar and has been named multiple times to Newsweek's list of the top 50 rabbis in America. Enjoy my conversation with Rabbi Elie Kaunfer. Elie, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. Really looking forward to this episode. Before we get into Hadar and everything you're working on today, why don't you give us sort of a peek behind the curtain of where you're from, your upbringing, everything that led you to where you are today.
Great. It's an honor to be here. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island. My dad is a rabbi. My mom is a Jewish educator. And I was in the first class in a school that they started in Providence, a Jewish day school. So I really didn't want to be a Jewish educator, really never thought that was going to be my path. I wanted to be a journalist. So I spent some time as a banker, as an investigator. But when actually after some time in Israel, seeing sort of the broad variety of what Jewish life could be, and coming back to live in New York, spent some time thinking with some friends about what a Jewish community could look like if we designed it from scratch. So we did that. It was a minyan called Hadar. It's still vibrant today on the Upper West Side. And that really led me to understand that I indeed wanted to be a Jewish educator and rabbi. So that's what I became, and have now been running Hadar with my partners in crime for the last 15 years.
Amazing. This is my 17th or 18th episode. I think that was the shortest introduction we've had. Everyone gets the same first question, so kol hakavod. I'm curious though, growing up sort of in the house of Jewish educators, as you mentioned, versus the Jewish education that we see today. I mean, can you sort of take us through the evolution of how you have seen Jewish education from your childhood up until now, you as being a Jewish educator? What's changed? What stayed the same?
Yeah, I would say in my childhood, I often say that I was homeschooled, just not at home, meaning that my mom was my fifth grade Chumash teacher, and my dad was the principal, and so they had an educational vision that they brought to me, but also to other kids in this school together. And so I think for me, my experience of Jewish learning was very integrated. It was what you did at home and what you learned in school were very tied together, and it sort of built a wonderful universe of what it means to have a picture of Jewish living and learning. I think that, at that time as well, that's an unusual experience for someone to have that level of integration. And I think in some ways that really drives my own vision of what Jewish life could be. It doesn't have to be a siloed pocket of your larger life, but something that is integrated. I think in the world that we live in today, integration and sort of cross-fertilization across different parts of your life is, an ongoing challenge. And so I think that's just a harder goal to achieve. But when you are able to have that flow between your home life, your school life, your professional life, and just see the through line in that, it can be very powerful.
Why do you think integration has become so much more challenging today?
Well, I think in general, people are more atomized, separate from Jewish life. You have your work and you have your home life. The COVID era has only exacerbated that sort of siloing of people's lives. And I think in some ways it's amazing to have the internet that can link you to other people who are not near you. but in other ways, it sort of diminishes the power of local community and experience. And so whereas it used to be that, where you lived mattered because it was who you were near and who you would spend time with, now you can spend time with anybody, basically, no matter where they are. And so I can move out of the city or whatever it is, and still have ties to other people in my life. But it sort of leads to, when I'm online or when I'm on this platform, I'm connecting with these people. And when I walk out my front door, I'm connecting with other people. It's a much more disjointed, I think, existence than it used to be. Growing up in Providence, a very small town generally, and a small Jewish community, but it felt sort of united in the sense that the people you see when you walk around town are the people who you build your communal life with, and that's a powerful experience that I think is harder to come by these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, some of the thoughts that are going through my mind right now are like, the people that sought out Jewish community when you were a child, which I guess by the looks of it, I don't know, you look like you're in your early 40s, so maybe 30 years or something like that. But like, it just seems to me that, like, let's just say our parents' generation, they sought out Jewish community, and the extensions of that, I think, for different reasons than maybe our generation does. I would say that the world is obviously continuing to change, and we're not going back. We know we're only going forward. Digital, I think, will become virtual, literally and figuratively, within the next few years. So I guess it feels to me, as I'm trying to understand the so-called organized Jewish world more and more, it just feels to me that we're still holding on to sort of those pillars of why people joined Jewish communities 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Yet everything else in the rest of our lives, for those that don't live a highly Orthodox life, everything else has progressed and evolved to now, morph into the digital world, and then eventually now coming up here, the virtual world. Is that a proper analysis, or do you see it differently?
Well, are you saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, or are you just saying that's what it is?
No, I think that's what it is, for better or for worse. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, also for better and for worse, Judaism has not been a culturally aligned phenomenon. Judaism has always been countercultural, and so in that way, I'm not sure that the power of Jewish living has to track 100% with what the dominant culture is experiencing or driving towards. You don't want to lose the potential of the contemporary world and the benefits of how we connect in different ways now. But to me, Judaism is not necessarily judged on, is it keeping up with the times? Because it never did. It was always oriented to sort of offer a critique of the times to some extent, and to present an alternative to what the dominant culture valued.
It's interesting. I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, one of the things that sometimes gets lost in some of the work that we're trying to do is we're not trying to reinvent Judaism or make it something it never was. In my personal Jewish journey, I find that things that have been talked about for thousands of years in the Jewish tradition are still very much relevant today, if not more relevant than ever, right? Just in terms of different wisdom or thoughts or so forth. But I also feel that there has to be that balance, right? There has to be that. I think you just alluded to it, where it's, we don't want to necessarily change Judaism, but we do want it to evolve with the times so that it can remain relevant. And I'm curious, I don't think Judaism is the problem, right? Mm-hmm. I think the issue is the people in organizations that deliver the Judaism. I know, for example, that at Hadar, you have 2 podcasts, one for adults, one for children. And I'm just curious, how do Jewish organizations, in your mind, based on your work with Hadar, how do they themselves update how they deliver Judaism, Jewish experiences, Jewish community, etc.? What are some of the work that you guys are doing, especially with these podcasts?
Yeah, so I appreciate it, just an opportunity to talk a little bit more about Hadar. You know, I think our idea when we started Hadar was to imagine a world in which the substance and power of Jewish learning and living shines through. What would it take to allow people to experience the power of Jewish learning and living in an immersive and intense kind of way? That was really the driving vision at the beginning, and for that reason, we started with intense programs like a full-on summer yeshiva experience where people, from morning till night, were studying and learning and eating and praying together. And I think there's something powerful about collecting participants who are so motivated to have that experience and are joining of their own volition to dive in to an intensive, immersive Jewish life. So we wanted to sort of capitalize on that demand and offer something that could meet that need. Now we are an institution, meaning it's a nonprofit, and we have like an org chart and do fundraising. But I think at the end of the day, the beating heart of what we're trying to put out in the world is mission driven and is very clear. In other words, it's something that we saw a need for and put out into the world, as opposed to, we've been doing this for the last 100 years, I guess we'll do it for the next 100 years. In other words, there's not a lot of stagnancy in an organization that you start up, because you remember why you started it. I think that's also, you mentioned the two podcasts that we have. One is called Tashma for adult listeners, and for kids, it's called Torah Time. That's an example of, we're trying to leverage a medium that well, in which kids and adults are flocking to now. Not because everything else that Judaism was doing up until now is suddenly irrelevant, but it's another pathway to reach people who are looking for something. So I think, when I'm not sure that I see the Jewish world as sort of the dichotomy of, the organized Jewish world versus the, innovative startup world. I think there's a lot of people, thank heavens, who are trying to bring Judaism to the people who want to experience it in a powerful way. And that can be done, through startups, that can be done through legacy organizations. I think the main driver for me is, how mission driven are the people who are in those organizations? How clear do they have a picture of what they're trying to put out in the world, and is it working? Is it attracting the people who are looking for something? Because I think one of the constants in human history is humans are looking for something. They're not just get up in the morning, go to work, go to sleep. It's like the drive for meaning and connection and community, the search for substance is age old. And so I think, to the extent that we're trying to meet that demand in creative and relevant ways, then we're doing our job.
So you're a rabbi, and I'm just curious, and I've been thinking recently about, what's the role of the rabbi today and moving forward? Because it seems to me that for a variety of reasons, it's changing, whether we like it or not. And I'm just curious, as a rabbi yourself, what do you feel the role is of the rabbi moving forward? Is it the same as what it's been, or do you feel that it's going to start changing according to different trends or demographics or what have you?
I think it's a really interesting question. One that I think about a lot. For me, the vision of a rabbi has always been coupled with the vision of a teacher. When you think of the rabbis who appear in the Talmud, the rabbis in our textual tradition, by and large, they are playing a teaching role. And there are many ways in which people can be teachers, people can be educators. But I think that, our modern society doesn't pay teachers very well, but I think they still value teachers as a concept. People think they have something to learn, and they would seek out a teacher in the broadest sense. So I think if rabbis can lean into the role of teacher, there's something sort of authentic and and ancient about playing that role. I think, rabbis play other roles that are also important. And what's a little bit confusing in this day and age is that those roles can get blurred because of the different pathways to achieve that. Like, for instance, rabbis hold people and guide them through ritual highlights of their life, their wedding or a funeral, maybe a bar bat mitzvah. I think what's interesting about the current moment is that lay people are also getting into that business. In other words, if you read the wedding announcements, someone is a universal life minister, which they became for the day in order to do the wedding of their friend or their relative. And of course, structurally in Judaism, you don't need to be a rabbi to conduct any ritual event like that. So I think where rabbis can be extra value add in a world in which anybody basically can get a license to wed other people or to guide them through a funeral is, can you show up pastorally for people? And that's of course a role that teachers play as well. Can I hold your emotional journey and not just deliver facts to you as a teacher? But I think when rabbis are able to play the pastoral role that accompanies those ritual moments, then they are a cut above your average layperson who decided to, get overnight wedding license ability. In this day and age, I think people still need some sort of spiritual guidance and emotional support that rabbis can offer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm actually meeting with somebody here in Israel coming up called the Millennial Rabbi. Do you know him?
Nope.
So I find it interesting because I'm trying to envision, I'm spending more time now going into virtual reality and in general, right? And saying what is the virtual world going to look like, and what is Judaism? How is it going to come to life in a virtual world? What will be interesting is okay, the idea of a rabbi that serves at a congregation. Well, to me, congregations are not going to exist the way that they used to. Meaning, you can all, when I say we as a virtual world will all be able to subscribe to any virtual congregation, so to speak, or any virtual movement or organization. And it's not going to be based on geographics necessarily. And so then it becomes, you don't need, if all of a sudden you have, all of the United States subscribing to this one sort of virtual congregation, well, you don't need all the rabbis of the actual congregations to then be part of the virtual one, because it becomes a little bit redundant. So I'm trying to figure out how a rabbi is going to play a part in sort of this virtual world.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting point, which is to say that to the extent a rabbi's main role is to deliver like an engaging Saturday morning experience or a powerful sermon, thanks to COVID's acceleration, we've sort of stepped into a world in which a lot of Jews are now not going local anymore. They're going to your top providers of that experience online. And whereas being online on Shabbat is not my vision of how Shabbat plays out for many, even most American Jews. That's clearly what's going on. And then I would say, I'm not sure that makes the local rabbi irrelevant so much as shifts the emphasis on where they can bring value. In other words, if I'm in a Zoom room or a broadcast or a virtual world with 10,000 other Jews and we're listening to a powerful sermon from a rabbi, that can be very meaningful, but I'm not going to have a relationship with that rabbi or probably with anyone else in that virtual world. I mean, maybe to some extent you can have some connections, but they're somewhat attenuated. And so I think the power of the local rabbi then really does start to focus on the relational side. And in some ways, maybe it's a corrective because, you think back, 50, 60 years ago, you would go into a synagogue, it was packed, there were hundreds of people in the room. you might not also have had a relationship with that real life rabbi. They might have also seemed sort of like distant and unapproachable. And now I think to be a successful rabbi locally, the whole value is about the relationship and the approachability. And so I actually think that whereas the emphasis could be shifting, that eternal human need to connect directly with someone who can guide you and provide you with some spiritual support will outlast any shift into a virtual congregation that you're predicting.
I want to talk a little bit about your book, Empowered Judaism, which is actually how we got connected. I know you wrote it a few years ago, but I think it's now more relevant than ever. Tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book and ultimately what people can get out of it.
Yeah, so Empowered Judaism was a book that I wrote because about 10, 12 years ago, a lot of the focus that I was doing in my professional and spiritual life was working with minyanim, with independent minyanim that are sort of startup congregations and communities in America and actually now in Israel as well. And what I saw as the power of those communities were people who were empowered to take control of their Jewish life and start something that reflected the vision of how they wanted to, mainly on Shabbat, how they wanted to connect as a community, pray, and connect to each other. And it was a very exciting moment in which people were sort of saying, I don't have to limit myself to the offerings that are out there. I can build something new. Of course, minyan building is an old Jewish practice, and in some ways, although it was sort of termed as innovative and new on the scene, and to some extent it was, I always really saw the work of minyanim as a return to the natural way that Jewish people would gather and have gathered for hundreds of, if not thousands of years. The introduction to the book was written by a professor of American Judaism, Jonathan Sarna, who sort of traced the line of minyan growth going back to the 1800s in America. And his point was sort of like, this is the next wave in a line that's been going on for a long time. And that's what it always felt like to me. In other words, sort of like it was a return to tradition more than a break with tradition. I think why it's relevant today is mainly because of the ethos of Empowered Judaism is to say, you don't have to rely on someone else to do Judaism for you. You can actually take control of your Jewish life and envision and build the world that you want to see out there. Now, I do think that what it means to be an empowered Jew it's not an attitude shift alone. It doesn't mean like, oh, yesterday I was sufficing with what was out there, and today I'm creating better options. I think it's an expression of a vision in which Jews are educated enough that they actually can be empowered to build that Jewish life. And I think education and sort of connection to the sources of how you might become empowered is critical. And that's sort of where I ended up devoting my professional energies, is to allow more Jews to become more educated, more connected, and for them to take that education and connection and bring it forward in an empowered orientation to their Jewish life, as opposed to sort of just taking what's out there and either accepting or rejecting it.
So it's kind of like this DIY Judaism, right? I mean, it's something that I know recently has picked up, this do-it-yourself Judaism. You sort of talked about it in a different word, Empowered Judaism, but to me, it feels like it's sort of the same family. Going back to our conversation about organizations, right, where they rely on people plugging into them financially, communally, and otherwise. And here we're now talking about sort of the individual in their own Jewish journey, taking what they want from it and sort of crafting it in ways that feel good and right for them. And it feels like to me there's a little bit of a contradiction there, right, between the individual and the organization, the organizations have had tremendous power in the Jewish world really since probably the late 1800s, early 1900s, and have grown exponentially since then. But now we're talking about sort of coming back to the individual and empowering their Jewish journey. How do you see that as somebody who is the head of an organization?
Yeah, well, I think that I don't really think there's something entirely DIY about Judaism. That is to say, even the minyans themselves were leveraging the investment of a lot of institutions in the education of the people who ended up starting those minyans. In other words, like going to day schools and having experiences on college campuses with minyanim there, synagogues, youth groups, all that fed into the vision of what one does with their own Jewish life. So I guess where I would see it is less of a total dichotomy between DIY Judaism and organized Jewish life, but rather, what's the end goal of any Jewish organization? Is it to get you to pay dues to the organization, or is it to get you to have a powerful Jewish life that you believe in and care about? Now, sometimes when those align, everything's great. Like I would love to pay dues to an organization that helps me be empowered and to live out my vision of Jewish living. And so I don't think it has to be necessarily outside of institutions, but I think if you take as an assumption that the success of, let's say, Jewish schooling as a kid is that you belong to a synagogue but don't show up, or make a donation to a federation but don't really get involved, but therefore are labeled as affiliated, to me that's not really the line of success. The line of success is, do you feel inspired and emboldened to take Jewish life to the next level? You might do that through your synagogue, you might do that by starting a minyan, but the point is, you've had some experience and education that allows you to envision what is possible. And I think to the extent that people are taking more ownership of their own Jewish journey and not just relying on whatever's handed to them in a particular moment, that's exciting. Where it gets dangerous is if people say, I don't need any Jewish infrastructure at all. I can figure it all out on my own without any, educational journey or teachers or communal infrastructure. Then I feel like it might be a little bit sort of moving into arrogance and probably misalignment with what's possible. So I think there is a delicate balance there between, institutions and organizations helping you achieve that level of empowerment without joining the institution as the end all be all of success. But also valuing the way in which institutions can provide you with that background to really envision what's possible in Jewish living.
So one of the things that I find interesting about this conversation is that by giving more power to the individual, I believe that one of the outcomes of that will be that the individual ends up coming back to the community and to the organizations. But I do feel that today, and this is of course a generalization, not speaking about every single organization, but I do feel in general that many of the organizations, for a variety of reasons, don't feel comfortable empowering the individual, for whether it's self-serving reasons or insecurity or whatever. And so that they end up pushing them away or not welcoming in new sort of community members, versus saying, no, we want to empower you. And by doing that, we trust that you'll end up coming back to us somehow, some way.
Yeah, I think in some ways, look, empowerment and education in my mind are very intertwined. And the question is, what is the goal of an education? Is the goal, you think about this like in a totally non-Jewish context, like when you learn math in school, is the goal of math to get you to achieve a grade that will allow you to attend a particular college? In which case math is simply just almost like a checkbox that you need to gain some utilitarian mastery over to move to the next level of your life? Or is math about, understanding the mysteries of the world and putting order to them? Or, is math about taking control of your own finances, or understanding how computers or space travel works. And so when I'm teaching you math, what's my end goal? Is my end goal to help you get into the college, or is my end goal to allow you to take the gift of math and apply it where you feel inspired? So I don't think that depends on the institution that's teaching you math, meaning every institution has a culture, and so they might be culturally oriented one way or the other. But you could imagine a very powerful old school way of learning math that empowers the student to take those principles and apply them in exciting ways outside of a utilitarian mode where you're just getting accepted to college. And the same applies with Jewish education as well. Is the goal of Jewish education to get you to land in an organization later on in life? Like, if you go to Hebrew school, then your chances of joining a synagogue later are upped, and therefore, like, it's worth it. Is that the metric? Or is the metric to say, Judaism offers so much in terms of organizing your life around a vision and a purpose, and I want to give you as much as I can around that. You might express that vision and purpose in a synagogue later on, and probably you will, but you might not. You might, do other things with that education. The goal of it is to give you access and ownership around it, and not to have me be the only gateway to your Jewish wisdom. I think that's where things get dangerous, when rabbis or teachers say, well, the only way, not that they say it explicitly, but implicitly the model is, the only way you're going to learn the next thing is if you come to my next class. And then you're totally reliant on the teacher for your journey. Sometimes that can be powerful, but at the end of the day, it sort of runs out of, either you run out of teachers, or you run out of, you achieve a certain level, and then you're out of that system. What would it look like if all of the education orientation was not about you coming back to my next class, but rather you now can do this on your own. You've been leveled up to, you think about it with reading. It's like reading English, let's say, if our whole orientation to literacy was, and come back to class and we'll read the next book together, then no one could ever read the newspaper on their own. You know what I mean? And that would be a limited society. So I think that's where the empowerment can be exciting, is to say, I'm going to teach you how to read on your own. And that's an amazing gift that you can apply in many different ways. You might come back to learn with me more, but you might take it in other directions.
I want to talk a little bit about, I believe I read that you have a longtime teacher, Rabbi Daniel Landis. I had a previous guest on my podcast, Hal Lewis from Hadar Institute, who talked about the importance of having teachers, of not being afraid, even if you're in this case, you're the president and CEO of the Hadar Institute, still understanding that you can be a student as much as a teacher. And I'm just curious if you could share with us in a few minutes, what are some of the things that Rabbi Landis taught you, instilled in you, that you still, take with you today?
Yeah, well, my relationship with Rabbi Landis is very special because it started really many years ago when I was living in Israel for the year in 1995, and it was his first year in Israel, having made Aliyah from Los Angeles, and I had the privilege of having a lifelong teacher. That is to say, when I was in my early 20s, I encountered him at first, and I didn't actually get smicha from him. I didn't get rabbinic ordination from him until just 3 years ago. And I think it was two things that were powerful about that. One is to have a teacher for so many years of your adult life. And it's not like we were constantly in contact throughout that period, but just having a teacher figure, I think, is powerful. It's relational. It's not organizational. It's relational, and also the ability to say, in the middle of your career, I'm going to take time out of being CEO and go back to full-time study to be a student again. Just is an orientation of we always have something to learn. Even longtime teachers, and to be able to do that process with him just a few years ago when I was on break from my day-to-day in New York at Hadar and living in Israel for that year in 2018, was powerful just for me to sit and learn and be a student 100%. And teachers guide you both in the material that they teach you technically, but also in the role modeling that they play in your life. And being able to watch someone, how they interact with other students, how they think about the Jewish world has been powerful for me for all this time.
You mentioned the fact living in Israel. Looking back, what did that have, what kind of impact did that have on your Jewish journey? I'm asking because to me, it feels like there's two camps of Jews. Again, on a high level, general speaking, type of thing. I feel that there's sort of the Jews that, they know about Israel. They probably haven't been here, maybe no plans to come here, either for a visit or for even a part-time stay. And then there's the ones that do come here, whether it be for a part-time stay, make aliyah, maybe they move back, maybe they stay. Like the relationship with the country and the people and the history and everything is obviously very different between those two camps. Birthright is obviously sort of, an opportunity for more Jews to come and see Israel. But then you could say 10 days is nothing, and probably, over the course of a lifetime, it's not going to have the kind of impact that we'd all like it to have. I'm just curious, like, do you think that we should be putting more of an onus on sort of relocations, if you will, between Jews around the world to Israel, even for 6 to 12 months, which, is not that much, but it's still enough to really understand a little bit more than 10 days, for example. Just curious, like looking back on your time in Israel and how that's impacted your sort of Jewish life and Jewish journey, and maybe what we can learn from that, if anything.
Yeah, well, personally, Israel has had a major impact on my life. And I've had the privilege of living in Israel for 4 different years at different points in my life. And I would say also, just getting back to education for a moment, the seeds of Hebrew that were planted in me through my Jewish education as a child ended up also allowing me to experience what it means to live in Israel in a deeper way, because I had access to the language directly. Look, for me, living in Israel was powerful on so many levels. It offered so many visions of what a spiritual and engaged life could be. It wasn't chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. It was like, a full, almost like being unplugged from the matrix. It's like you see the real potential of what Jewish spiritual living can be, expressed in so many different varieties. That's something that is very special about Israel. And I would say the other piece of it was when I was there with my family and my kids. They were in Israeli schools and had Israeli friends, and themselves learned how to speak Hebrew, to see the possibility of what it means to join the project of Israel as a place to live more permanently. Even we had the glimpse of that when our kids were in that mode. I think that also was very powerful in my own sense of what Jewish life could look like in this day and age when the state of Israel exists. And it's an option for people to actually live in. I think in terms of other people getting to Israel, I would say, anything we can do to link up the Jewish people's experience such that the diaspora and Israel are not two theoreticals. I theoretically know about Israel, I read about it, but if I actually experience it and live it and have personal connections and relationships there, my understanding of what it means to be a Jew in the world is altered. And I would say that's the reverse as well. We just welcomed at Hadar a group of Israelis who were visiting to sort of tour what diaspora Jewish life looks like, and gave them a sense of what we do at Hadar in terms of our learning and approach. And, for a lot of them, they had never heard of such a thing, of, a place in which there's a serious high level of Jewish learning and all people are counted as equal citizens in the minyan. And so I think there's an enrichment that goes both ways. But in terms of, diaspora living Jews to spend time in Israel, and ideally, as you say, not limited to a 10-day sort of designed experience, but of sort of a deeper level of living and connection. Well, that would be amazing. I mean, you see it to some extent, the value of political Zionism around, what's happening in Ukraine, and just having a safe haven for Jews is so important to start off with. But going beyond that level, to allow Jews to experience the variety and the nuance of what Israeli Jewish life is, I think is really powerful, and the more of that, the better, in my opinion.
This has been really a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much for doing this, and best of luck moving forward.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.